This is Eileen Griffin with the Heartland View from the Heartland Daily News, providing you updates and information and analysis on breaking public policy stories and events that affect your life, your health, your freedoms, and our nation's economy. Today we've got several stories. We've got some COVID updates in terms of economics, some of the economic consequences as we're starting to get some data now. We're also going to talk a little bit about maybe some things that could be done better and lessons learned. And we're going to start with a story from John Stossel about property rights. So John Stossel has an article in Budget and Tax News called Get Off My Property. And he shared this information. He interviewed a farm owner named Mike Fauner. And this gentleman owns a strawberry farm in California. And there were some union activists coming out to the farm trying to get people engaged in joining the union. And Mr. Fauner asked that they not be on the property. And it turns out that California does allow for these types of raids on farms. They're allowed to go out as union activists to get opportunities to talk to the people working in the farms. And in fact, refusing to allow access puts the farm owner in violation of the law. So Stossel said the property invasion law supporter said that United Farm Workers Union deserves the exception to property rules because these rich farmers abuse migrant workers. So they're allowed to be out on the property. Mr. Fauner called this absurd. He said, quote, 450 people travel 400 miles. Why in the world, if they were being abused, would they continue to do this year after year? And fewer than 10% of Mr. Fauner's workers have joined the union. And Mr. Fauner already pays double what the California minimum wage is for the workers on his farm. The union activity happens at a cost. Mr. Fauner only has 6 weeks to harvest, pack, ship, and process his strawberry plants. It's a very limited window. But in response to the farmers' complaints, California Deputy Attorney General Matthew Wise claimed, quote, any access to the property is brief and unobtrusive, end quote. And the law allows union organizers to enter the farm 3 hours a day, up to 120 days a year. But that's hardly brief or unobtrusive. The unions claim the workers will not have access to the information about the union without having access to the farm. But Mr. Fauner says that's ridiculous. There's plenty of opportunities. These workers have access to email and internet and social media, and in fact, he said every single worker carries a cell phone in his back pocket. So they have plenty of access to information. He also says, what about after work? What about on their own time? What about after work hours? The union activists could certainly go to their motel rooms and talk to them there. So there's plenty of opportunities to gain this information. He concluded his interview with John Stossel by saying, quote, this is trespassing. You should be going to jail for doing this, end quote. So the question is, do we have the right to control our own property or don't we? Something to think about. So we're going to talk a little bit now about post-COVID, some of the data that's coming in, and Budget and Tax News reports that there's been variations determined between the free states and the lockdown states. And we're already starting to look at this data and see the results overwhelmingly support that the free states made the right decision in loosening up some of those restrictions, as opposed to the authoritarian tactics that were used in other states. Florida has fared far better than New York and New Jersey, for example, with no correlation between lockdown stringency and death rates. But the lockdowns carried enormous economic and human costs. So this variation, if it's not clear, you have to ask yourself, what about all the mental health issues? What about the domestic violence? What about the increase in child suicide, all that isolation these kids have dealt with for a year? What about the increased drug overdose? What about the loss of livelihoods? People losing their jobs, people losing their businesses. Some of these businesses will never come back. And the unemployment rates differed. The Labor Department data, free states returned very quickly to pre-pandemic status, according to the labor market, whereas the lockdown states still struggling. The worst 10 states for unemployment, between 7 and 9%, include the lockdown states, New York, New Jersey, California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, DC, and Rhode Island. Clearly there's a trend here. The free states fared far better in terms of economic outcomes without a dramatic difference in health consequences. As famed economist Thomas Sowell said, when it comes to complex issues of public policy, quote, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, end quote. There was never an easy answer to the COVID pandemic, but the economic, health, and societal outcomes of free states suggest they may have made the right call in rejecting the authoritarian instinct embraced by too many of their neighbors. And also, we now have more census data which showing that the government tax revenue concerns really haven't been borne out. Several government tax revenue data points suggest that there hasn't been a lot of negative impact by COVID-19. A recent update by the Census Bureau, state and local tax revenue provides full comparisons for the tax years 2019 and 2020. And by looking at this data, making these comparisons, the conclusion is that overall state and local tax revenues were not heavily impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. State tax revenue was down about 1% in 2020. In this case, an increase in personal and corporate income tax receipts mostly offset a drop in sales tax revenue during the pandemic. Results from the two series imply a slight increase in local government revenue, likely due to increased property tax receipts amid the strong residential property market. Tax revenue performance varied among states. So Alaska and North Dakota, they suffered due to the drop in energy prices, but we're already seeing some recouping from that. So we do expect to see price rebounding, which will change that for them. But otherwise, you look at Hawaii and Nevada, some of that can be explained by a significant drop in tourism in those states. Idaho, on the other hand, had the biggest increase in tax revenue. So many people moving to Idaho, and some people just escaping the lockdown states and at least temporarily getting out to Idaho. California actually did just fine. There was even a small tax revenue increase, largely because so many tech workers in California, they were able to continue working and doing well. And in fact, many of these businesses were thriving during the pandemic. So we have to question, does this really make sense? This data undermines the case for the large states and the local aid packages included in the most recent stimulus and relief bill, particularly the American Rescue Plan Act signed by President Biden in mid-March. The data really suggests that that may not have been necessary. And when it's all over and the taxpayers and lawmakers look back at the COVID-19 pandemic, it will be clear that states and local governments did not need a huge federal bailout in 2021. Now, one other area we've been looking at is this inflation question. Are we going to see inflation? Are we not? There's a lot of new money in the system. So when are we going to see this inflation? So Budget and Tax Reports, Richard Salzman had an article talking about what should we be looking for inflation. Worries have intensified, the higher U.S. inflation in the coming years, and it is an important issue because higher inflation, even if it remains in the single digits, it erodes the value of financial assets, bonds, bills, stocks, relative to tangibles, precious metals, and other commodities, like real estate. So double-digit inflation inflicts still worse harm, as it also sabotages economic growth and boosts the jobless rate. But we still haven't answered the question. Is there evidence of coming higher inflation? By some accounts, yes. U.S. inflation expectations today are worse than at any time since 2011, according to the tip spread. That's the difference between nominal Treasury note yields and the real yield on Treasury inflation-protected securities. The spread has widened over the past year. However, two other reliable market-based signals suggest inflation might stay low. So in short, predictive market prices are not signaling a materially higher inflation rate in the U.S. Of course, the Federal Reserve lately has massively increased bank reserves and the money supply. So in the process of recklessly monetizing U.S. national debt that now totals $27 trillion, double its level of a decade ago. And bank reserves are now $3.4 trillion, which is double the level of that figure a year ago. Most of these are excess reserves beyond what's required by the Fed. That means that banks are hoarding cash. They tend to hoard money in bad times, when they lack sufficient confidence. And that's precisely the case today, even if officials won't admit it. We should always remember that the value of money, its purchasing power, is determined, like the value of other goods, by supply and demand, never by just supply. In the 3 occasions since the turn of the century where faulty inflation forecasters failed to consider both factors, each time out of sheer panic, the Fed massively increased reserves and money supply, but banks, businesses, and households likewise massively increased their holdings of idle cash, demand for money. This help explains why the dollar's value has not yet plunged despite these massive increases in Fed money creation. Just because a reckless central bank foists tons of fake money on banks, businesses, and households does not mean any of them must spend it. Fiscal monetary recklessness itself can signal private sector actors not to part with safe liquid assets. Eventually, of course, they may choose to flee the money and the debt, bringing higher inflation rates and higher interest rates. Meantime, the prudent observer must never neglect to consult the demand side of money. Okay, back to the pandemic lockdowns. Now let's talk a little bit about what we can learn. What do we learn from what happened in this scenario, and can we do better in the future? So Budget and Tax News reports that after a year of government-mandated lockdowns, there are questions we need to ask. How did it happen? Why did it happen? What were the real costs of this lockdown? And what happens to all these freedoms that we've given up? How can we prevent this from ever happening again? To answer these and other lockdown-related questions, we're not going to be able to look at the state and federal governments. Those people were a little too close to this, and of course the media outlets aided and abetted the whole situation. So what we need to look at is an outside answer. For answers to these questions, the American people will need something more. What we need is an independent inquiry, a commission to review the what, the why, the how, and the details of the lockdown. The legislative and executive branches have created scores of these kinds of commissions over the years, as it tends to let lawmakers off the hook and allow them to defer some of these tough calls to others. And some commissions have played an important part in helping the country understand and investigate policy failures, address problems, respond to and prepare for crises, learn from mistakes, and prevent future mistakes. This capacity for self-reflection and self-criticism, this willingness to publicly review what we did wrong, is one of the strengths of the West in general and America specifically. Learning from mistakes, and in doing so, trying not to repeat them, is how individuals and nations make progress. We can't change what happened, but we can learn and prepare to do better for future pandemics. We know they'll come. The pockets of individual liberty that rejected the authoritarian approach came from the grassroots, and it worked its way up. Those that perpetuated the lockdowns are likely to not want their decision reviewed, as it might require them to admit they made a mistake of historic proportions. So a COVID-19 lockdown commission should be launched, including civic associations, research institutes, civil society organizations, houses of worship, trade guilds, business groups, all those committed to individual liberty and its essential analog, individual responsibility. As Alex de Tocqueville wrote of America's dynamic non-government sector in the 1830s, he said of Americans, quote, "Americans constantly form associations, religious, moral, serious, futile, general, restricted, enormous, or diminutive, associations to give entertainments, to found seminaries, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send missionaries to the antipodes," end quote. Almost 200 years later, Americans and their associations and foundations, charities, houses of worship, societies, and clubs continue to find a way, often in spite of the roadblocks created by government. So a COVID-19 lockdown commission is necessary, not just to look back and count the costs of the lockdowns, but to maintain the forward momentum. People are already worried about new strains, new variants, and there's even questions about the vaccine and whether or not we can still remove the masks and how we can function with the vaccine. So we need somebody to look at this and say, what can we do to return to normalcy? As it arms citizens with what they need to maintain momentum, and it addresses those hard, crucial questions, this COVID-19 lockdown commission would revive a spirit of individual liberty and individual responsibility in America. It would equip a community of free people to be vigilant against the reemergence of lockdowns and disseminate information and knowledge which are essential for a self-governing people. Despair and uncertainty was fueled by the disconnection from work, family, and worship during the lockdowns. It's during these times of crisis that people most need the peace of visiting their house of worship, the social support of family and friends, the comfort and the regularity of going to work and interacting with your coworkers. All of these comforts were lost during the pandemic. More than 100,000 U.S. businesses were completely lost. Lots of people lost their jobs. They lost the opportunity to gather for worship. So most of us rapidly learned that this faux connection of the digital age is no substitute for real human connection. America's independent sector and civil society associations are founded on this very premise: the notion that we can do more in community than in isolation. Tocqueville understood that America doesn't revolve around Washington or the state capitals. He said, quote, "The intelligence and the power of the people are disseminated through all parts of this vast country." Tocqueville marveled. He said, "Instead of radiating from a common point, they cross each other in every direction." End quote. Now more than ever, Washington and the state capitals need to be reminded of that. And if you'd like to support an organization that's working to inform you and provide you information about all these issues, please go to our website, heartland.org. Thank you for listening. Have a great week.